You know, looking back, it's funny what you choose to ignore. The little things, the tiny inconsistencies you brush off because the alternative is just too weird to think about. That's where my story starts. Not with a bang or a scream, but with a bent arm. My name is Claire. At the time, I was a junior in college, majoring in art history and minoring in being completely broke. To fix the latter, I'd landed a part-time job that felt like a gift from the universe. It was at a small, independent clothing boutique called Elysian. The name was a little pretentious, but the place itself was my sanctuary. It was tucked away on a quiet, tree-lined street, nestled between a used bookstore and a tiny Italian cafe. It wasn't the kind of place that got a lot of foot traffic. It was for people who knew it was there. Inside, it was all warm wood, soft lighting, and the gentle, calming scent of cedar hangers and new fabric. My manager, Sarah, was a whirlwind of creative energy who trusted me completely. Most days, especially on weekdays, it was dead quiet. I could sit behind the heavy oak counter, my textbooks spread out, the store's soft indie pop playlist humming in the background, and just be. It was the perfect student job. It was my safe space. The centerpiece of Elysian was her. The mannequin. There was only one. Sarah had found her at some vintage market and said she had a certain grace. She stood on a low platform right in the middle of the store, so she was the first thing you saw when you walked in. She was made of that old, heavy fiberglass, painted a matte, creamy white. Her features were serene and stylized, not hyper-realistic, which I was thankful for. She had a long neck, a calm, slightly aloof expression, and a wig of sleek, black hair cut into a sharp bob. We dressed her in the store's most elegant outfit of the week. To me, she was just part of the furniture, a silent coworker I jokingly called Florence. The routine was always the same. I'd arrive at 9:45 a.m., unlock the heavy glass door, and the first thing I'd do is disarm the security system. The panel was right inside the door, to the left. It would give 3 sharp, impatient beeps, and I'd punch in the code. Silence would return. Then, I'd flip the main lights on, bathing the shop in that warm, welcoming glow. It was a Tuesday in early October when the first odd thing happened. I remember it was chilly and gray outside, the kind of day that made being inside Elysian feel even cozier. I did my usual routine. Key in the lock, door swings open, the little bell above it gives a single, cheerful jingle. I stepped inside, dropped my backpack and tote bag behind the counter, and went to the alarm panel. Beep, 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 code entered, silence. I turned to flip the lights on, and my eyes, as always, went straight to the center of the room. To Florence. And I stopped. I just stood there for a second, frowning. Something was off. It was nothing major, nothing that would make a customer bat an eye. But I knew. I saw her every single day. The day before, when I'd closed up, I specifically remember dressing her in a new charcoal gray cashmere sweater and a long, flowing skirt. I had posed her myself. Both arms were down, hands relaxed, one slightly in front of the other. It was our standard, elegant pose. But that morning, her right arm was different. It was bent at the elbow, her hand resting gently on her hip. My first thought wasn't fear. It was annoyance. Did Sarah come in after I left? Or maybe early this morning? She sometimes did that if a new shipment arrived, but she always texted me. I pulled out my phone. No texts, no missed calls. Okay, weird. Maybe I did it. Maybe I was so tired yesterday that I posed her like that and just forgot. It was possible. Midterms were coming up, and my brain felt like it was running on 3 hours of sleep and too much caffeine. I walked over to her, my footsteps echoing a little in the empty store. I reached out and took her cold, plastic arm. The joint was stiff. It took a decent amount of force to move it back down to the standard position. I definitely would have remembered doing that. Wouldn't I? I stood back, looked her over. Now she looked right again. Serene, still, inanimate. I shook my head, a small laugh escaping my lips. I was losing my mind. It was nothing. I was getting worked up over absolutely nothing. I dismissed it completely, wrote it off as a brain fart, and went about the business of starting my day. I turned on the music, booted up the computer, and settled in behind the counter with my Art of the Italian Renaissance textbook. The day passed in its usual slow, peaceful rhythm. A woman came in around noon and bought a silk scarf. A couple of college girls browsed for about 20 minutes around 3, giggling in the dressing room before leaving empty-handed. For hours it was just me, the quiet music, and the rustle of textbook pages. but I found my eyes drifting up from the book more often than usual. I'd look over at Florence, standing there under the spotlights. She was perfectly still, of course. Her arm was exactly where I had put it, but now she'd been marked. My brain had flagged her as something to watch. It was a low-level background hum of awareness I couldn't seem to switch off. Each time I looked, and she was unchanged, I felt a little flicker of relief, immediately followed by a wave of embarrassment for even feeling it. "She's a doll, Claire," I mumbled to myself at one point, feeling like a complete idiot. Get a grip. The rest of the afternoon was uneventful. The sun started to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the hardwood floor. The cozy warmth of the shop felt different in the dimming light. Deeper, somehow, quieter. At 6:55 p.m., I started the closing routine. I cashed out the register, tidied the few items that had been moved, and wiped down the glass counter. I turned off the computer and the sound system, plunging the store into a profound silence broken only by the hum of the small refrigerator in the back room. At 7 p.m. on the dot, I walked to the front of the store, flipped off the main lights, and the room was instantly swallowed by shadow, with only the soft glow from the streetlights outside filtering through the front window. Florence was now just a silhouette, a tall, slender shape in the center of the gloom. I set the alarm. The panel gave me 60 seconds to exit and lock the door. I grabbed my bags, stepped outside into the crisp autumn air, and pulled the heavy door shut behind me. I heard the solid, reassuring thunk of the bolt. I turned the key in the lock. Click. Double-checked it. Solid. Safe. My car was parked just down the block. Before I turned to leave, I did what I always did. I took one last look back at the store through the large plate glass window. It was a habit, a final check to make sure I hadn't left a light on or something. The streetlights cast a pale, watery light inside, making everything look silver and gray. I could see the dark shapes of the clothing racks, the solid block of the counter, and in the middle of it all, Florence's silhouette. And then it happened. For a single, stomach-dropping second, in that murky light, I saw her head move. It wasn't a big movement. It was a slow, deliberate tilt, a slight incline to her left, as if she were curiously watching me walk away. The movement was so small, so fluid, it couldn't have been a trick of a passing car's headlights. It was organic. I froze on the sidewalk, my keys suddenly feeling ice cold in my hand. My heart did a painful little stutter in my chest. I stared, unblinking, into the dark store, my breath caught in my throat. She was perfectly still. The head was straight, facing forward, exactly as it should be. The sleek, black bob of her wig was unmoving. The pale silhouette was just that, a silhouette. Lifeless, motionless. I blinked hard, once, then twice. My eyes were playing tricks on me. It had to be a shadow, a reflection, the strain of a long day. My sleep-deprived brain was just projecting things. It was the only explanation that made any sense. It was the only sane explanation. But as I finally turned and started walking toward my car, forcing my feet to move, I couldn't shake the feeling. The chilling, impossible image was seared into my brain, the slow, silent tilt of that head in the darkness. It was the light, I whispered to the empty street, the words turning to white puffs in the cold air. Just a trick of the light. I told myself that all the way home. I told myself that as I double-checked the locks on my apartment door. I told myself that as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for a sleep that wouldn't come. It was just a trick of the light. It had to be. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay in bed, staring at the shadows on my ceiling, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. That slow, impossible tilt of a plastic head in the dark. I kept replaying it, trying to debunk it. It was a reflection from a passing car. It was my exhausted eyes playing tricks on me. It had to be, but the feeling it left behind, that cold knot of dread in my gut, it wouldn't go away. It felt real. The next morning, walking to the store felt different. The crisp autumn air didn't feel refreshing, it just felt cold. The familiar street seemed a little less charming, a little more watchful. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I was a stressed-out college kid who had scared herself with shadows. That's all it was. I got to the door of Elysian and my hand hesitated for a second over the lock. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the key in and turned it. The little bell gave its usual, cheerful jingle as I stepped inside. The air was still and smelled of cedar and wool. I dropped my bags behind the counter, my heart thumping a bit too fast, and walked over to the alarm panel. Beep, beep, beep. I punched in the code, and the store fell back into its deep morning silence. I turned and flipped the main light switch. The warm glow flooded the room, chasing the shadows away. My eyes went, against my will, to the center of the room. To Florence, and I froze. I mean, literally stopped moving, one hand still on the light switch. It wasn't like before. It wasn't just a slightly bent arm. This was different. This was deliberate. Yesterday afternoon, I'd spent about an hour sitting on the tall stool behind the counter, trying to cram for my Italian Renaissance exam. But the heavy textbook was making my neck ache, so for a while, I'd gotten up and stood leaning against the front corner of the counter. I'd propped my book on the smooth oak surface, hunched over it slightly, my left hip canted out and pressed against the wood for support. I remember tucking a piece of hair behind my right ear, my right hand resting loosely on my thigh. It was a specific, unconscious pose of a tired student trying to absorb information. And that's how Florence was standing. Not sort of like it. Exactly like it. Her plastic body was angled toward the counter. Her left hip was pushed out, as if leaning on a surface that wasn't there. Her head was tilted down, her blank gaze directed at the floor where a book would have been. And her right hand was resting on her thigh, fingers slightly curled. The air left my lungs in a quiet whoosh. It couldn't be. It was the most insane, paranoid thought I'd ever had. But it was too perfect. Too precise. The angle of the hip, the tilt of the head, it was a mirror of a moment that had been entirely my own, in an empty store. My mind started racing, trying to find a logical path. Sarah. It had to be Sarah. Maybe she came in early, saw how tired I looked yesterday, and decided to play a little joke. A weird, kind of unfunny, I see you, joke, but a joke nonetheless. It was the only explanation that wasn't completely insane. I walked over to her, my boots soundless on the polished floor. I felt like I was approaching a wild animal. Up close, the pose was even more unnerving. It was so human. I reached out a shaky hand and touched her arm. It was cold, hard, and unyielding. Just fiberglass. I pushed her upright, moving her limbs back into their standard, graceful but neutral position. The joints creaked in protest. It took real effort. For the rest of the morning, I couldn't focus. I'd sit behind the counter, pretending to read, but my eyes would flick up to Florence every 30 seconds. She stood there, still and silent, wearing her cashmere sweater, exactly as I had put her. But she wasn't just a prop anymore. She was a question mark in the center of my sanctuary. The feeling of safety I loved about this place was gone, replaced by a low, humming anxiety. It felt like the walls had eyes. The day was excruciatingly slow. One customer, an older woman, came in and bought a pair of leather gloves. She smiled at me and commented on how peaceful the store was. I forced a smile back and said, "It is. I love it." The words felt like a lie in my mouth. The peace was the problem now. The silence wasn't calming anymore, it was heavy. It gave me too much time to think, to stare at the mannequin, to feel the creeping sensation of being watched. I started to feel a genuine, gut-level fear. It wasn't just a prank. A prank is a one-time thing. This was a pattern. The bent arm, the head tilt I thought I saw, and now this perfect mimicry. Someone was messing with me. Someone who could get in and out of a locked, alarmed store without a trace. Or, someone who was watching me in a way I couldn't understand. I called Sarah around noon, trying to keep my voice casual. "Hey, Sarah, quick weird question for you," I started, twirling the phone cord around my finger. "Shoot," she said. Her voice was cheerful, a little distracted. I could hear the sounds of a busy cafe in the background. "Have you, been coming into the store after I leave or before I get there in the morning?" There was a pause. "No, why? Is something wrong?" "Oh, no, nothing's wrong," I lied, my heart sinking. "It's just, Florence. Her pose is different every morning. I thought maybe you were tweaking it." Sarah laughed, a genuine, warm laugh that made me feel like a complete fool. "God, no. I haven't touched her in weeks. You've got the magic touch with her. Maybe she's just coming alive at night, like in that old movie." My blood ran cold. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Maybe. Claire, are you okay? You sound stressed. Is it midterms?" "Yeah," I said quickly, latching onto the excuse. "Yeah, just swamped. Probably just tired and forgetful. Get some rest, hun. Don't let the art history drive you crazy. I'll see you Friday." We hung up and I slowly placed the receiver back in its cradle. The click echoed in the silent shop. I was alone in this. No one had been in the store. Sarah thought I was losing my mind. And maybe I was. For a fleeting second, I wondered if I was the one doing it. If I was so sleep-deprived I was moving the mannequin in the evenings and completely blocking it from my memory. It sounded like something out of a psychology textbook. The thought was almost as scary as the alternative. I got through the rest of the day in a fog. When I closed up, I did everything with robotic precision. I checked every corner of the small store, even the stockroom in the back. Everything was as it should be. Before I set the alarm, I stood in front of Florence. I looked at her serene, blank face. I decided to try one more time for a rational explanation. Yesterday, after changing out of my work clothes, I'd come out of the dressing room and paused for a moment to check my phone for messages before grabbing my bag to leave. It was a simple, meaningless action. I took Florence's left arm and bent it, raising her hand up to about chest height, as if she were holding a phone. Then I tilted her head down slightly to look at the imaginary device. It was an awkward, unnatural pose for a mannequin. There was no way I could forget putting her in this position. I stood back. She looked ridiculous. And then, I did something that made me feel even crazier. I took out my phone and I took a picture of her. The flash was startlingly bright in the dim store. I now had proof. A time-stamped photo of Florence in this bizarre, specific pose. Okay, I whispered to the empty room. Let's see what happens now. The next morning, the walk to the store was filled with a sick, nervous energy. I wasn't just anxious, I was on a mission. I had my evidence. Today would either prove I was going insane or prove that something was seriously, terrifyingly wrong. Key in the lock, jingle from the bell, bags on the floor, alarm disarmed. I held my breath and turned on the lights. My stomach dropped. Florence was no longer in the center of the room. She had been moved about 3 feet closer to the front door. And her pose had changed again. Her hand was no longer raised to look at a phantom phone. Instead, her right arm was extended, her index finger pointing. It was pointing directly at the door of the small, single-stall dressing room. The same door I had walked out of right before locking up the previous evening. It was a direct response. A statement. It was no longer mimicry, it was a conversation, and I was the only one who could hear it. It was like a child's game of I Spy, only the thing being spied on was me. My every move, my breath hitched. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This wasn't a prank. Pranksters wanted an audience, a reaction. This was quiet, insidious. It was a psychological game, and I was the only player. The store, my safe space, now felt like a cage with a predator I couldn't see. I walked numbly towards the counter, my mind blank with fear. That's when I saw it. On the pristine, polished hardwood floor, near where Florence's platform now stood, was something that didn't belong. It was a smudge of dirt. Dark, damp earth, smeared into the shape of a partial shoeprint. It wasn't big, but it was definite. It wasn't from my boots, which were always clean. And it wasn't from Sarah's stylish heels. And no customer would have gotten this far into the store on a dry day with muddy shoes. The fear I'd been feeling, the quiet, humming paranoia, suddenly crystallized into something sharp and cold and solid. The picture on my phone didn't matter anymore. The poses didn't matter. This was physical proof. Someone had been in my store. I pulled out my phone again, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I scrolled to the picture I took of Sarah for the store's social media page a few weeks ago. I needed to talk to her, to show her the photo, the mud, to make her believe me. But as I looked at my contacts list, a new, colder thought took hold. What would I even say? Sarah, someone is breaking into the store every night, not stealing anything, but moving the mannequin to reenact my private moments and leaving single, non-incriminating smudges of dirt on the floor. She would tell me to get some sleep. She'd tell me to call the police, who would come and find no signs of forced entry and file a report that would go nowhere. They would look at me, a trembling, paranoid college girl, and they would think I was crazy. A profound sense of isolation washed over me. It was worse than the fear itself. I looked from the muddy smudge on the floor to the silent, pointing figure of Florence, and then to the heavy glass door of the empty street outside. I was being hunted in plain sight, and I was completely, utterly on my own. And the person responsible knew it. That was the whole point of the game. I couldn't call Sarah, not really. I mean, I stood there, phone in my hand, my thumb hovering over her name, and the words just wouldn't form in my head. "Hey, Sarah," said the mannequin I thought was just acting weird is now pointing at things, and there's a smudge of dirt that I think is from a ghost who is also a stalker. Yeah, right. She'd be planning an intervention for me by lunchtime. She'd think the stress of midterms had finally snapped something in my brain. The police were an even worse idea. A single muddy smudge, on a rainy day, in a retail store? They'd look at me like I was wasting their time, which, from their perspective, I would be. I had nothing but a stomach full of ice and the growing, suffocating certainty that I wasn't alone in my own life anymore. The feeling of isolation was the worst part. It was a physical weight on my chest. I looked at the smudge, then at Florence, her plastic finger still aimed at the dressing room door like an accuser. This wasn't a game. A game has rules you can understand. This was different. This was meant to make me feel exactly like this, crazy, helpless, and alone. The person doing this knew no one would believe me. That was their power. That night, after a day spent jumping at every shadow and flinching every time the bell on the door chimed, I locked up with a new kind of resolve. Fear was still there, a cold current running under my skin, but something else had surfaced alongside it, anger. A hot, defiant kind of anger. I was done being the audience to this sick little show. I was going to set my own trap. I walked over to Florence. She stood where I'd left her that morning, in the neutral pose I'd forced her into. I looked at her blank, placid face. No more subtlety, no more poses I could second guess or dismiss as my own forgetfulness. I was going to create a pose so specific, so utterly bizarre, that it could not possibly be a coincidence. I started with her legs. It took some effort, fighting the stiff joints. I bent her right leg up at the knee, a sharp 90-degree angle, so she looked like she was frozen mid-goose step. It was awkward and unbalanced. Then, her arms. I wrenched her left arm straight up, fingers pointing at the ceiling, like a student desperate to answer a question. I took her right arm and bent it at the elbow, placing her hand flat against her stomach, as if she were pledging a bizarre allegiance. I tilted her head back, so her empty eyes stared at the track lighting. When I was done, I stepped back. She looked absurd, a chaotic mess of limbs. She looked like a bug that had been zapped with electricity, frozen in its death throes. No one, not me, not Sarah, not any sane person, would ever, for any reason, pose a mannequin like this. It was ugly, it was jarring, it was perfect. Then, I did the most important part. I took out my phone. The harsh, clinical glare of the screen felt like a weapon. I opened the camera and the flash went off, stark and violent in the darkened store. I took a picture from the front. Click. The sound echoed. I took one from the left side, capturing the ridiculous angle of her raised leg. Click. I took one from the right, focusing on the hand to the sky pose. Click. I even took a close-up of her base on the floor, showing exactly where she was standing, a few inches from a specific knot in the hardwood. I had a timestamp. I had angles. I had irrefutable, digital proof. Okay, I whispered to the silent, ridiculous figure. Let's see you explain this away. I set the alarm, my hand steady for the first time all day. I locked the door, the finality of the bolt sliding home feeling like a gauntlet being thrown down. Sleep wasn't on the menu that night. I didn't even try. I lay in my bed, the glow of my phone illuminating the ceiling as I swiped through the photos of Florence over and over again. I memorized every angle, every shadow. It felt like studying for the most important exam of my life. I wasn't just afraid anymore. I was waiting for a verdict. Either I would wake up and prove myself sane, or I would wake up and confirm I was being hunted. I wasn't sure which was worse. The walk to the store the next morning felt like a march to an execution. The air was cold and damp, and every crunch of leaves under my boots sounded unnaturally loud. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. My hands shook so much it took me 2 tries to get the key into the lock. Jingle. The bell sounded mocking. I stepped inside, dropped my bag by the door, and didn't even bother going to the counter. My eyes were locked on the center of the room. The air was thick with anticipation. Hands trembling, I flipped the main light switch. The warm lights flooded the space, and my breath caught in my throat. For a split second, I felt a wave of dizzying relief. Florence wasn't in the crazy, zapped bug pose. She was standing normally, both feet on the ground, arms resting gracefully at her sides, head facing forward. The relief was so intense it almost made my knees buckle. It's over. I'm just losing my mind. I'm exhausted and overworked and I'm having some kind of psychological breakdown. I did this myself and blocked it out. The thought was terrifying, but it was better than the alternative. But then the relief curdled and died, because she wasn't in the right place. I had photographed her by the knot in the wood. I knew exactly where she was supposed to be. Now, she was a good 6 feet closer to the front door. She had been moved, deliberately. I took a slow, hesitant step forward, my boots silent on the floorboards. It was like approaching the scene of a crime. My rational mind was screaming, trying to find a reason. Sarah came in early to fix the horrible pose, thought she was doing me a favor, and moved her while cleaning. It had to be that. It had to. I stopped. My eyes fell to the floor, to the smooth, polished space around the mannequin's circular white base. And my blood ran cold. It wasn't a smudge this time. It wasn't partial or ambiguous. It was a footprint, a whole, perfect, undeniable footprint, stamped in dark, damp mud on the pale wood. It was the print of a heavy boot, with deep treads, like something you'd wear for construction or hiking. It was big, much bigger than my foot, or Sarah's. It was a man's footprint. And it wasn't old. The edges of the mud were still wet. I couldn't breathe. All the air had been vacuumed out of the room, out of my lungs. The quiet hum of the lights overhead was the only sound in the universe. This was it, the verdict. All the theories, all the self-doubt, all the desperate attempts to rationalize it all away, they just evaporated. The paranoia wasn't paranoia, it was instinct. The mimicry, the pointing, moving the mannequin, it was all real. Someone, a man, had been in the store. He had a key, or he knew how to get past the alarm. He had come in after I left. He had seen my absurd, defiant pose. And he had calmly, deliberately, moved the mannequin back to normal and put her right here. It was a message. It was him saying, I see your little test. It's cute, but I'm still in control. I backed away slowly, one step, then another, my eyes glued to the footprint on the floor. It was like a venomous snake coiled in the middle of my sanctuary. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to put a hand to my mouth. He had been here, just hours ago, standing right there, in my space. My back hit the counter with a soft thud. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers feeling like clumsy, useless sausages. I had to call someone. Sarah, the police, anyone. I didn't care how crazy I sounded anymore. I had proof. A wet, muddy footprint was proof. My hand was shaking so badly that the screen was just a blur of icons. I squinted, trying to find my contacts. My gaze lifted from the phone, across the room, past the damning evidence on the floor, to the thing he had moved. I looked at Florence. She stood there, serene and silent in the morning light filtering through the front window. She was just a fiberglass shell in a nice wool coat. But she wasn't, not anymore. She was his proxy, his messenger. He had touched her, moved her, posed her. His hands had been on her. And in the quiet, sterile light of the shop, I saw it. It wasn't real, it couldn't have been. It was a trick of the light, a figment of my terrified imagination. But I saw it as clearly as I saw the footprint on the floor. The faint, painted-on curve of her placid, pink lips seemed to be pulling upwards at one corner. A tiny, knowing, triumphant smirk. I didn't call the police. You have to understand, that's the first thing people ask me when I tell this story. Why didn't you just call the cops? It's a fair question. It's what any sane person would do. But standing there, in the dead quiet of the boutique with the smell of old wood and new fabrics, with a single, perfect, muddy footprint on the floor, sanity felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. A muddy footprint, that's all it was. A man had been in the store. On a rainy night, that wasn't exactly a headline. I could hear the questions already. Was anything stolen? No. Was anything broken? No. Was the alarm triggered? No. So, a janitor, maybe? A delivery guy who used the wrong key? They'd have a dozen rational explanations, and each one would make me sound more and more like a hysterical girl who was seeing things. They would take a report, maybe, and that would be the end of it. And he would know. He would know I tried and failed. He would know he had won that round, that his power was in how unbelievable it all was. The smirk I'd seen on Florence's face had vanished, of course. It was just a trick of the light, a product of my frayed nerves. She was just a doll, standing there in her stupidly expensive coat, impassive and empty. But she wasn't empty, not really. She was full of him. His presence lingered on her, on the way she stood, on the very air around her. He had touched her. He had been here. I spent the rest of the day in a state of high alert that was so exhausting it felt like a physical illness. Every time the bell on the door chimed, my head would snap up, my heart hammering against my ribs. I'd watch the person walk in, my eyes immediately flicking down to their shoes. A woman in cute ankle boots, a teenager in pristine white sneakers, an old man in polished loafers. None of them had the heavy, treaded boots that had left their mark on my floor. But every single one of them felt like a suspect. The way they browsed, the way their eyes would slide past me. Were they just looking at clothes, or were they looking at me? Were they cataloging my reactions? It was torture. My safe space, my quiet little haven, had been contaminated. It now felt like a cage, and I wasn't sure if I was the zookeeper or the main exhibit. I tried to do my accounting homework at the counter, but the numbers just swam in front of my eyes. I kept reading the same sentence over and over. My focus was gone, replaced by a constant, humming anxiety. I found myself staring at the muddy footprint, which I'd left untouched. It was my one tangible piece of evidence. My proof that I wasn't crazy. It was like a holy relic and a curse, all at once. When it was finally time to close, the relief I expected never came. It was replaced by a new, creeping dread. The sun was going down, and soon I'd have to leave. I'd have to lock the doors and walk away, leaving my store, my proof, in the dark, where he operated. I went through a closing up ritual that bordered on obsessive. I locked the front door, rattling the handle 3, 4, 5 times to make sure the bolt was home. I walked to the back, to the small storeroom. The lock on that door was a heavy, old-fashioned deadbolt. I turned the key until my knuckles were white. Then I did something I'd never done before. I dragged a heavy box of old catalogs over and wedged it against the door. It wouldn't stop a determined person, but it would make noise. That was something. I checked the windows, making sure the latches were tight. The whole time, my movements were jerky and fast. I felt hunted. I just wanted to get out. Get out and be somewhere, anywhere, else. I grabbed my coat and my backpack from behind the counter, my mind racing. Should I stay at a friend's house? Should I call Sarah and just blurt it all out? The footprint, the poses, everything? My hands were shaking as I stuffed my textbook and notebooks into my bag. I was so frantic, so desperate to just be gone, that I was clumsy. Things spilled on the counter. A pen, my wallet, a little tube of lip balm. I swept them all back into the bag with a hurried, trembling hand. I set the alarm, the loud, piercing beeps a countdown to my escape. The final click of the front door lock behind me was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. I didn't look back. I practically ran down the street. That night was a blur of unease. I didn't sleep in my own bed. I ended up crashing on the couch at Sarah's apartment after feeding her a half-baked story about my building's water being shut off for emergency repairs. She bought it, mostly, but she kept giving me these concerned looks. I guess I looked as bad as I felt. Lying there on her lumpy sofa, the sounds of the city outside her window felt different. Not familiar and comforting, but full of hidden threats. Every car that backfired, every shout from the street below, made me jump. Sometime around 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling, I came to a decision. I was done. Done being scared, done being silent, done second-guessing myself. The footprint was enough. It was real. A man was getting into the store. That was breaking and entering, period. Tomorrow, first thing, I would go to the store. I would not touch a single thing. I would take a high-resolution photo of that footprint, and I would walk into the nearest police precinct and I would not leave until someone listened to me. I had a plan, a solid, rational plan. And with that tiny flicker of control, I finally drifted off into a shallow, dreamless sleep. The next morning, I walked to the store with a new sense of purpose. Fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was overshadowed by a grim determination. I was taking my space back. Jingle. The bell sounded less mocking today, more like a starting pistol. I stepped inside. The air was still and cold. My eyes went straight to the spot on the floor. It was still there. The muddy footprint, now dry and caked to the polished wood, was completely undisturbed. A wave of relief washed over me. He hadn't come back. My proof was safe. Okay, Lamb, you can do this. I took my phone out, my hands surprisingly steady. I opened the camera, ready to document my evidence. Just as I was about to crouch down, my gaze drifted upwards, a subconscious habit now, checking on Florence. She was standing in the exact same spot we'd left her, in the same simple, neutral pose. Everything was normal, everything was exactly as it should be, except for the one thing that wasn't. Something was in her hair. On the left side of her head, nestled in the strands of her dark, synthetic wig, was a small, silver object. It caught the morning light coming through the front window, glinting. I lowered my phone. My breath hitched. I took a step closer, then another. My heart, which had been so steady with resolve just a moment before, began to trip over itself. It was a butterfly, a small, delicate, silver butterfly hair clip. My hair clip, the one my mom had given me for my 16th birthday. The one I always wore, a nervous habit, twisting it in my hair when I was thinking. The one I must have knocked off the counter last night in my rush to get out. I stopped dead a few feet away from the mannequin. The world seemed to narrow to a single, horrifying point. That clip, on her. He had come back. He had to have. He'd come in, seen the clip I'd left behind on the counter. And he hadn't just moved it. He hadn't tossed it aside. He had picked it up. His fingers had closed around the delicate metal wings. He had walked over to her. And he had, with what I could only imagine was a terrible, deliberate gentleness, slid it into her hair. He had arranged it, just so. This was different. This wasn't a prank. The poses, the moved mannequin, even the footprint, that was about territory. That was him saying, I can get in here. This was about me. This was possessive. This was an act of violation so profound it made my skin crawl. He took something of mine, something personal, and put it on his doll. He was dressing her up with my life. A cold, heavy nausea rolled in my stomach. I felt exposed, stripped bare in the middle of my own store. He wasn't just watching me anymore. He wanted pieces of me. My plan to call the police, my careful, rational resolve, it all just evaporated in a hot flash of rage and disgust. This wasn't a crime scene to be preserved anymore. This was a desecration. All I could think was, get it off her. I don't remember making the decision to move. 1 second I was frozen in place, the next I was closing the distance between me and the mannequin, my footsteps loud in the silent room. My anger was a shield, blocking out the fear. This was my store. That was my clip. He was not allowed. I reached out, my fingers aiming for the silver butterfly. My hand was a blur of motion, fueled by a rage so pure it felt clean. I was going to snatch it back, rip it from her stupid plastic head. My fingertips were a millimeter away from the cool metal. And then I heard it. It was not a loud noise. It was so quiet, so subtle, that I almost missed it. I could have mistaken it for the rustle of my own sleeve, the hum of the overhead lights. But it wasn't. It was a sound, a soft, wet, organic sound. It was the sound of a slow, quiet exhalation, a breath, and it came from directly behind the mannequin. My hand froze, a single millimeter from the silver butterfly. The breath, it wasn't a gasp or a sigh. It was just air, a slow, quiet, deliberate release of air that was warm and wet and fundamentally alive. It was the sound you hear when you're standing too close to someone in a quiet room. It was the sound of lungs working, and it had come from the space directly behind the mannequin. My brain just refused to process it. It was like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. Mannequins don't breathe. It's a foundational rule of the universe, right up there with gravity. So, my mind offered up a dozen other possibilities in the space of a single, frantic heartbeat. It was the HVAC vent kicking on. It was a draft from under the door. It was the fabric of my own sleeve brushing against my ear. It was anything at all, other than the one thing it sounded exactly like. I snatched my hand back like I'd touched a hot stove. I even looked at my fingertips, half expecting them to be burned. I stumbled backwards, my heel catching on the edge of a rug, and I almost went down. I pinwheeled my arms, my backpack shifting heavily, and managed to stay upright. I stood there, panting, my heart feeling like a trapped bird beating against my ribs. I stared at Florence. She hadn't moved. She was exactly as she had been a moment ago, plastic, still, lifeless. The silver butterfly clip still glinted in her fake hair. She was a doll, just a doll. You're losing it, lamb. That's what it is. You're overtired, you're stressed, you slept on a couch, and now you're hallucinating. You're hearing things. That's 100 times more likely than a breathing mannequin. I clung to that thought like a life raft. It was my only anchor to sanity. I stood like that for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 30 seconds, my eyes locked on that mannequin, daring it to move, to breathe again. Nothing. The store was tomb silent. The only sound was the frantic drumbeat in my own ears. Okay, deep breaths. You heard something. It spooked you. Now, get back to the plan. Photograph the footprint. Call the police. Get out. The thought of kneeling down on the floor, of turning my back on that thing, was suddenly impossible. My skin prickled with a primal kind of wrongness. The feeling of being watched was no longer a vague paranoia, it was a physical weight pressing down on me. Just then, my phone buzzed in my pocket, the vibration so sudden and sharp it made me yelp. I fumbled for it, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The screen lit up. Sarah. My boss. I answered, my voice a croaky mess. Hello, Lamb? You okay? You sound weird. Sarah's voice was a blast of cheerful, oblivious normalcy that felt like it was coming from another planet. Yeah, I'm fine. Just a little tired, I lied. Well, listen, I know this is a huge pain, but I've got some bad news. The truck with the new fall line just got in a day early. They're going to drop it off this afternoon. 5 huge boxes. You think you could possibly stay a little late tonight to get a head start on inventory? I know it's last minute, but if we can get it all checked in and tagged tonight, we can put it out first thing tomorrow. I'll pay you for overtime, of course. My first instinct was to scream no. No, I can't stay late, the store is haunted, or there's a man living in it, or I'm going insane, take your pick. But what could I say? The words died in my throat. The mannequin breathed at me. She'd think I was on drugs. She'd call my parents. And then a different, stranger thought pushed its way through the panic. Staying late, with the doors locked, with the store to myself. Maybe that was a good thing. Maybe in the quiet, I could prove to myself I was wrong. I could search the whole store, top to bottom. I could demystify it. I could take back control. Turn on all the lights, blast music, and count sweaters. A normal task, a boring, mundane task that would chase the ghosts away. It was a stupid, irrational idea, born of sheer desperation. Lamb, you there? Yeah, sorry, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Yeah, I can stay. No problem, you're a lifesaver. Seriously, I owe you big time. Just lock up like usual when you're done. See you tomorrow. She hung up. I was left standing in the silence again, which now felt heavier, more menacing. The decision had been made for me. I was going to be here, late, alone. The rest of the day was a nightmare of forced composure. A few customers trickled in. I smiled, I pointed them toward the sale rack, I rang them up. All the while, I never let the mannequin out of my sight. I watched her from behind the counter, my eyes tracing her outline, waiting. She never moved. Of course, she didn't. She was a mannequin. The breath had been in my head. It had to have been. But the certainty I was trying to force on myself felt thin and fragile. Finally, 6 o'clock arrived. I went to the front door, my hand hovering over the lock. The sun was setting, painting the street in long, orange shadows. Outside, the world was winding down, people heading home to their families, to warm dinners. I was about to lock myself inside a place that felt deeply, fundamentally unsafe. It was the dumbest thing I'd ever done, but I turned the key anyway. The click of the deadbolt sounded like a cell door slamming shut. The delivery truck had dropped off 5 massive cardboard boxes that now sat in the middle of the floor like monoliths. Task at hand, Lamb. Focus on the task. I put my headphones on, but the music felt tinny and useless. I took them off. I needed to hear. As I worked, the weather turned. The sky, which had been clear just an hour ago, grew dark and bruised. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. Then came the rain. It started as a light patter and quickly grew into a torrential downpour, lashing against the large front windows of the boutique. The sound of it drumming on the roof and glass was relentless, isolating me completely. The cozy little shop no longer felt like a haven. It felt like a trap, besieged by the storm. I slid open the first box with a box cutter and started the tedious process. Sweater, gray, cashmere blend, size medium. Check. Blouse, silk, floral print, size small. Check. I arranged them on the counter, tagging them, hanging them. My movements were automatic. My mind was elsewhere. It was in the corners of the room, in the shadows cast by the clothing racks, in the reflection on the dark windows that now only showed me my own strained face against the storm outside. I was halfway through the third box when I heard it. A sound from the back of the store. From the small storeroom where we kept overstock and cleaning supplies. It was a skittering, scratching sound. Faint, but unmistakable over the roar of the rain. My whole body went rigid. I held my breath, listening. The sound came again. Scrabble, scrabble, scratch. A rat. Relief washed over me so intensely my knees felt weak. A rat, of course. An old building like this, with a storm raging outside? It had probably found a way in to get out of the rain. That's what it was. A stupid, dirty rat. It explained the weird feelings, the sense of not being alone. My frayed nerves had just turned a simple pest problem into a monster. I almost laughed. A rat. I could deal with a rat. I made a mental note to tell Sarah we needed to call an exterminator. Feeling emboldened, almost euphoric with relief, I worked faster. The fear that had been strangling me for days finally seemed to be receding. I finished the last box around 9:30. My back ached and my eyes were blurry, but I felt a sense of accomplishment. I had faced the scary, dark store and I had won. It was just a store. The monster was just a rat. I gathered up the flattened cardboard boxes to take to the back. As I walked from the brightly lit main floor into the dim hallway that led to the storeroom, the feeling of unease returned, just a little. The hallway was darker, the sound of the rain more muffled back here. I pushed the storeroom door open and tossed the cardboard inside. I didn't turn the light on. I didn't want to see the rat. I just pulled the heavy door shut, making sure it latched. Time to go home. I walked back out into the main showroom, stretching my arms over my head, a real, genuine smile on my face for the first time all day. I was thinking about a hot shower and my own bed. My eyes drifted to the center of the room, to where Florence had been my silent, creepy companion all day. And my blood ran cold. The platform was empty. The spot where she had stood all day, all week, all the months I had worked there, was bare. Polished wood reflected the overhead lights. She was gone. My smile evaporated. My heart, which had just started to beat normally, kicked back into a frantic, panicked rhythm. I scanned the room, my eyes darting everywhere. Maybe Sarah had a key and came back while I was in the storeroom? No, I would have heard the front door. Did I move her? Did I move a 100-pound mannequin and somehow have no memory of it? No, that was insane. My mind was racing, trying to find a logical explanation, any explanation at all, and coming up with nothing. I stood there, rooted to the spot, staring at the empty circle of floor space. The rain hammered against the windows. A brilliant flash of lightning lit up the entire store for a second, a stark, bleached-out snapshot, followed by a crack of thunder so loud it shook the floorboards. And in that instant, the lights went out. The entire store plunged into absolute blackness. The hum of the lights, the quiet buzz of the small drink cooler behind the counter, everything just died. The only sound left was the storm raging outside and the blood roaring in my ears. The darkness was total, disorienting. I couldn't even see my own hand in front of my face. Panic, raw and pure, seized me. I started backing away, toward the counter, toward where I thought the phone was. My hands were out in front of me, fumbling through the black. Then, the streetlights outside flickered. They cast a weak, watery, orange glow through the rain-streaked front windows. It wasn't much light, but it was enough. It was enough to slice through the oppressive dark. It was enough to see. Someone was standing on the platform, right where Florence had been. It was a tall, slender figure. It was wearing her clothes. The expensive wool coat, the silk scarf. But it wasn't Florence. It was too tall, the shoulders too broad. And the face? Through the distorted, rain-slicked glass, in the sickly orange light, I could see it was wearing a mask. A smooth, white, utterly blank mask with no features at all. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a void, an eggshell-smooth absence of a face. I think I made a sound, a choked little gasp. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. Every rational thought had fled my mind, replaced by a singular, overwhelming wave of terror. This was it. This was him. He hadn't been a ghost or a prank or a rat. He had been here, the whole time. The figure stood perfectly still, a statue carved from nightmares. It was facing me, the blank mask seeming to stare right into my soul. The world narrowed down to just me and it, the storm a distant, meaningless noise. The silence in the store was deafening. And then, it moved. It wasn't a sudden movement. It was slow, deliberate, performative. It slowly, gracefully, lifted its left arm. The arm bent at the elbow. The hand came up, fingers slightly curled, positioning itself at an elegant, unnatural angle near its face. The head tilted just so, a perfect, calculated inclination to the right. The other arm remained straight down at its side. It was the pose, my pose, the impossible, specific, perfect pose I had set as a test. The one I had photographed. The one he could not possibly have known about unless he had been watching me, not just that night, but every night. It was a message, delivered in the language of my own deepest fears. I see you, I know you, I am in control. The sight of it, this living monster mimicking my test, shattered the last of my composure. The paralysis broke, a scream was building in my throat. The figure held the pose for one long, eternal second, a silent, mocking tableau in the gloom. Then the performance was over. The arm dropped, the head snapped forward, and in the flickering orange light, he lunged off the platform and ran directly at me. There was no thought, just screaming, a raw, primal sound ripped from my throat as my legs finally got the memo my brain had been screaming for the past 10 seconds. I scrambled backward, tripping over my own feet, my hands flailing in the dark. The world was a mess of lurching shadows and the hammering of the rain in my own ragged, panicked breaths. He was fast, way faster than a person pretending to be a mannequin should be. The distance between us closed in an instant. I felt a gust of air as he lunged, his hand swiping at the space where my head had just been. I fell backward, hard, my hip and elbow cracking against the polished hardwood floor. Pain flared, sharp and electric, but it was distant, muffled by the sheer volume of terror flooding my system. My eyes, now weirdly accustomed to the pulsing orange glow from the street, were locked on him. He was just a silhouette, a tall, lean shape of wrongness wearing my store's clothes, topped with that horrible, blank, white mask. He was a negative space where a person should be. My body moved before my brain did. My hand, scrabbling on the floor for purchase, hit something hard and cold and long. A metal display rod, one of the heavy-duty ones from a rack I must have knocked over. Without thinking, I just grabbed it. It was heavy, solid. My fingers wrapped around it, and as he took another step toward me, I swung. It was a wild, desperate, eyes-closed swing. I swung it like a baseball bat, putting all my weight, all my fear, into it. There was a sickening, solid thunk. The sound was followed by a grunt of pain. It wasn't loud, but it was real. It was human, and that, somehow, was more terrifying than anything else. It meant he was flesh and blood. He could be hurt, but it also meant he could hurt me back. He stumbled sideways, clutching his shoulder. It bought me a second. Maybe two. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I scrambled to my feet, my whole body screaming in protest, and I ran. I didn't run for the phone. I ran for the front door. The only thought in my head was out. Get out. I slammed into a heavy rolling rack of winter coats. Instead of trying to go around it, I shoved it with all my might. It went careening sideways with a shriek of tortured casters, crashing into another display and sending a cascade of blazers and blouses tumbling to the floor. It was a barrier, a clumsy, temporary wall. I reached the front door, my hands shaking so violently I could barely see the deadbolt. My fingers fumbled with the lock. It was a simple thumb turn, something I did every day, but right now it felt like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube in a hurricane. I could hear him behind me, the sound of him entangling himself from the mess of clothes. Come on, come on, come on, I whimpered, my voice a pathetic little prayer. My thumbnail bent backward as I finally got a grip and twisted. The deadbolt shot back with a deafening click. I shoved the heavy glass door open and burst out into the night. The rain was a physical shock, a cold, violent slap to the face. It soaked me instantly, plastering my hair to my skull, but I didn't care. I was out. I was on the sidewalk. I opened my mouth and I screamed. Not a real word, just a noise of pure, animal terror, a sound I didn't know I was capable of making. I stumbled into the street, my legs like jelly, and kept screaming. A pair of headlights cut through the downpour, blinding me. A car horn blared. The car, a big sedan, swerved and screeched to a halt just a few feet away from me. For a second, I thought I was going to be hit, and the thought was almost a relief. The driver's side door flew open. Hey, what the hell is wrong with you? A man's voice yelled. I just pointed back at the store, gasping, unable to form words. In there, he's in there. The car's high beams were now pointed directly at the storefront, illuminating the interior in a brilliant, harsh white light. They cut through the gloom, through the rain-streaked glass, and landed right on the doorway I had just fled. And there he was. The figure in the white mask was standing just inside the door, half hidden by a rack of dresses. Pinned in the headlights, he looked even more unreal. He froze for a single, horrifying second. I saw his head, that smooth, blank orb, turn from me to the car. Then, as if the light itself was physically pushing him, he retreated. He didn't run, he just dissolved back into the shadows at the rear of the store and was gone. The driver was out of his car now, a guy in a soaked business suit. He stared at the store, then back at me. What? Who's in there? I just stood there in the middle of the road, shivering uncontrollably, rain and tears mixing on my face, and pointed a trembling finger at the dark, empty boutique. The next hour was a blur. The police came, 2 officers, a man and a woman, their faces grim under the dripping brims of their hats. They wrapped me in a coarse, scratchy blanket and sat me in the back of their patrol car. It smelled sterile and faintly of stale coffee. While one officer took my statement, a disjointed, rambling mess of words about mannequins and breathing in masks, the other 2 cleared the store. They didn't find anyone. Of course they didn't. They went through the whole place, top to bottom. The back storeroom, the bathroom, the tiny office. Nothing. No sign of a forced entry. The back door was bolted from the inside. The windows were all secure. The only thing out of place was the mess I had made, the overturned clothing rack, the metal bar on the floor. I know how I must have sounded. Hysterical, crazy. The younger officer, the woman, was kind, but I could see the look in her eyes. It was a look of professional pity, the kind you give to someone who is clearly not well. They asked if I'd been drinking, if I'd taken any medication. They suggested that maybe, with the stress and the storm and the power outage, I had just imagined it. That I had spooked myself. The mannequin, I insisted, my voice hoarse. He was wearing its clothes. The wool coat. The male officer came back to the car. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was gentle but firm. "We found the mannequin. It was in the back storeroom, behind some boxes. It's wearing a summer dress." I just stared at him. I felt the world tilt a little. No, that wasn't possible. I had seen him. I had hit him. The grunt of pain was real. The blank mask was real. But here they were, telling me that what I saw didn't exist. They filed a report, promised to have a car drive by a few extra times during the night, and then they drove me home. They thought I was a scared kid who let her imagination run away with her. And the worst part was, for a moment, sitting in the silence of my own apartment, I almost started to believe them. The next few days were hell. Sarah, my boss, was understanding, in a way. She believed I'd been frightened by a possible attempted break-in, but the living mannequin part of the story was something we just didn't talk about. She had the locks changed. The store was closed for a day. I didn't go back. I couldn't. I quit over the phone, giving some weak excuse about my class schedule. But the police were more thorough than I'd given them credit for. A detective, a guy named Miller, called me 3 days later. He said they were reviewing all the security footage from the boutique's cameras from the past month, just to be thorough. He asked if I could come down to the station. I sat in a small, windowless room with him, watching a monitor. The footage was grainy, black and white. It was mostly boring, hours of me straightening clothes, helping customers, sitting behind the counter on my phone. We watched footage from a week ago, a busy Saturday afternoon. The store was full of people. "Okay, Lamb, watch this," Detective Miller said, his voice low. He pointed to a corner of the screen, near a display of handbags. Standing there, slightly behind a pillar, was a group of 3 mannequins. Florence, in the center, and 2 others I barely paid attention to. "What am I looking at?" I asked. "Just watch," he said. He used the mouse to zoom in. The image became a mess of pixels, but you could still make out the figures. He played the video in slow motion. On the screen, I walked past the pillar, my back to the mannequins, to help a customer with a pair of jeans. And then I saw it. One of the mannequins in the back. Not Florence. Another one. As my video self walked away, its head turned. It was a tiny movement. A slow, almost imperceptible swivel of its plastic neck. Its blank face following me across the sales floor. I felt the blood drain from my face. "Oh my God," I whispered. "We scrubbed back through weeks of footage," Miller said, his eyes never leaving the screen. "He's there, a lot. On busy days, he just comes in, dressed like a mannequin, and stands in a corner. Sometimes for hours. He's got makeup on, to make his skin look like plastic. The stillness, it's inhuman. No one ever noticed. The horror wasn't that a man broke in. The horror was that he had been standing right there, in plain sight, watching me, day after day. He had watched me work, watched me talk to customers, watched me eat my lunch. He had learned my habits, my movements, my posture. He had breathed the same air. It gets worse, Miller said, and his voice was grim. He clicked to another file. My guys did a full sweep of the store after they saw this. They found something. The video on the screen changed. It was a cop's body cam footage. The view was shaky, moving through the boutique and into the fitting room area. I recognized the floral wallpaper, the row of curtained-off stalls. The cop in the video walked up to the large, floor-to-ceiling mirror at the end of the hallway. The frame looked a little off, Miller narrated. A bit too thick. On the screen, a gloved hand pushed on the side of the mirror. With a faint click, the entire mirror swung inward, like a door. It revealed a space behind it. A dark, narrow crawl space, barely a few feet wide, running the length of the fitting rooms. Inside, the body cam light illuminated a filthy mattress, a pile of empty water bottles, wrappers from granola bars and beef jerky, and a bucket in the corner. He hadn't just been visiting. He had been living there, hiding in the walls of my safe space. Listening, my stomach churned. I felt like I was going to be sick. We found these in there, too, Miller said softly. He pushed a small stack of evidence bags across the table. They were photographs, dozens of them. They were pictures of me, taken on a telephoto lens. Me walking to class, me sitting on a bench in the campus quad, reading, me laughing with friends at a coffee shop. And then there was my silver butterfly hair clip. And my lost keychain. He hadn't just been in the store. He had been following me. Everywhere. I felt a wave of cold so profound it felt like my bones were turning to ice. My world, which had already been shattered, was now being ground into dust. The security of my entire life was a lie. Then I reached the last few photos at the bottom of the stack. My breath hitched in my throat. My vision swam. The pictures were different. They were dark, grainy, and taken through glass. It was my bedroom window. It was me, asleep in my own bed. Detective Miller put a hand on my shoulder, but I didn't feel it. I was staring at the image of my own sleeping face, captured by the man who had pretended to be a doll, who had lived behind a mirror, who had hunted me in the dark. The attack at the store wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. He knew where I worked. He knew where I went to school. And he knew where I lived. He knew where I slept. And he was still out there,